You're listening to KSQD, and this is Exploring Santa Cruz with your host, Jean Kratzer. We have a very special program today. We're going to be talking about the Elkhorn Slough in Moss Landing. This is something that we had a program on last month where we spoke with Dave Felice, who is the manager of the Elkhorn Slough Reserve. But now we have a very special story. It's going to come from some guests that I'd like to introduce to you. First, we have Robert Scoles and Ron Eby and Susan Russo, 3 volunteers working in the slough. Robert and Ron in particular have a very amazing story about some information that they found about the otters in the slough. And I'm going to let them tell the rest of the story.
Okay. Well, first of all, my name is Ron Eby, and Robert and I got started with this probably back in 2006 and have been working with otters since then. I love the introduction with the sound of the sea lions at the wharf. I think what's driven us through this is our enjoyment of being out in nature and observing things and seeing what's going on. We both started out as volunteers for another organization called Team Ocean, and Team Ocean provided us training and introduction to the marine mammals and other things around Elkhorn Slough and the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. But one of the things they had told us about was that on southern sea otters that they normally don't haul out to any extent. They only haul out, and hauling out means getting out onto the beach area or rock or pickleweed, getting out of the water. One of the things they had taught us was that that's not very often done by the southern sea otters. The northern sea otters do, but the southern sea otters is kind of a distinguishing factor between the two species. But Robert was curious, so he went to the harbor area, and he noticed along the beach area that he would see the footprints and also the scat from where otters had been there overnight. And it turned out that just nobody was looking at nighttime. So Robert introduced this fact, raised it in one of the Team Ocean meetings, and asked for volunteers to help him see what was happening at night. We began that, and the net result is we got a scientist that came along, a Dr. Daniela Maldini, kind of took us under her arm and advised us as we were seeing it that we needed to stop just taking notes of what was happening and we needed to organize. And so she set us out on a 2-year project where we went out twice a month for 24-hour observations. So we did that twice a month for 2 years, collected all the data, and the net result was we were able to publish a paper that showed that southern sea otters do indeed haul out on a regular basis. They do it at night when nobody's there to disturb them, but they do it on a regular basis, and it's for thermoregulation. It helps them not have to spend so many of the calories they get in from their prey items. They can conserve them by being warm on the beach. So that's what got us started, and right at the beginning, Robert clearly had the ability to research and find things out, and he dug into one book in particular by Adele Ogden. And Robert, do you want to say a little bit about that book and what we learned?
Well, I was down at Morro Bay and we were talking about otters, and in their basement they have a library, and I had noticed that a lot of previous papers from the early 60s mentioned the California sea otter trade. So they looked, and they happened to have a copy in their library, and it told me that we were really onto something. It mentioned the Russian poaching figures were so high that they thought there was probably a population of about 3,000 otters in San Francisco Bay alone.
Wow.
Essentially what we have for a population along its present range. So that's what really got us started in looking at what was really going on.
But it was a very exciting time for us because we were seeing things that we hadn't heard about before, and when Robert was doing his research, we realized that this had been the historical, not Elkhorn Slough necessarily, but estuaries and places like that had been the historical habitat for otters when they were in great numbers. And we began then just dreaming that maybe someday we'll see them in San Francisco Bay or some other area that is similar to Elkhorn Slough, and thinking what we learn about Elkhorn Slough might provide information for when they get in another area, or if somehow the scientists help them get to another area. So it was very fascinating. And from there, the next step was a study that I did with Brent Hughes, and that was looking at the otters and eelgrass relationship. And Brent had looked at the eelgrass in Elkhorn Slough and had noticed how it had a spike where it was growing quite well, and then it kind of died off. And then about 1995, it began a strong increase in the percent cover of eelgrass within Elkhorn Slough. When he looked at that and we talked about otters, we came to the realization that the more otters were in Elkhorn Slough, the better the eelgrass was doing. When the otters left, as they did for a temporary period, then the eelgrass began to die back again. Brent was very fascinated by that, and he came up with a theory that perhaps the otters were helping the eelgrass by keeping the crab population under control. And what he discovered was it's a 4-level trophic cascade where otters, just like they are good for the kelp beds, otters were good for the eelgrass beds. And the way it works is the otters keep the crab population under control. When they do that, the crabs aren't enough crabs to limit the population of the sea slugs and other creatures that go up and down the eelgrass and keep it clean. So once the crab population is down and those Taylor sea hares and other creatures go up and down the eelgrass and keep it clean, the eelgrass can photosynthesize and it responds quite well. So it ends up being a 4-level trophy cascade with otters on the top, again, that top predator, the crabs being kept under control, the grazers being able to therefore respond, and when they keep the eelgrass clean, then the eelgrass thrives. Our eelgrass beds in Elkhorn Slough now are much better than they ever were in the past, and that was a kind of a significant breakthrough, and that trophy cascade now sits right alongside the role that otters play in the kelp beds by keeping the urchins under control, and therefore the kelp beds are responding well. And it's really great because it shows not just that Elkhorn Slough is good for the otters, they have plenty of prey, all those crabs to eat, but as it turns out, the otters are really good for Elkhorn Slough because eelgrass itself is an endangered species, and enabling it to thrive in Elkhorn Slough then slows the currents, it traps sediments, and probably most importantly of all, it stores the carbon down in its roots, and that carbon will remain sequestered forever, basically, unless erosion eats through the mud banks and then once more gets it out into the environment. So that was very, very promising to us and a kind of a breakthrough study.
Does the eelgrass also help to keep down some of the pollution?
Yes, it does. And when we talk about pollution in Elkhorn Slough, the main pollution we have is actually the runoff from the farms. And this is legacy stuff that's happened over centuries. And that's because the Salinas River that drains the whole Salinas Valley actually comes into Elkhorn Slough. So at the southern part of Elkhorn Slough, the Salinas River comes in. And with it, it brings all the runoff from the farm fields. The farmers are doing a great job of controlling and doing the best they can to prevent those fertilizers and other products that they have to use to minimize the use and to ensure that there's no runoff. But when you get heavy rains that flood areas, there's a lot of legacy product that's out there. And as it turns out, Elkhorn Slough is one of the most polluted estuaries in the world. But it's those excess nutrients. And just as they feed the algae and the algae grows in Elkhorn Slough, it also feeds the eelgrass. So the eelgrass actually benefits from having the excess nutrients in there. Just like any other plant, they thrive off the nitrogen and phosphorus. And by having the otters keep the blades clean, keeping the crabs under control and allowing the grazers to keep the blades clean, it actually works out well. So we survive despite being so polluted.
So in effect, you have the otters both helping to sequester carbon through
Yes.
this chain of events and helping to keep down local pollution. That's quite extraordinary.
Yes, it is. And it's interesting you mentioned that. Tim Tinker, who's been one of the UCSC leading scientists, did a paper showing carbon sequestration due to otters in the kelp bed. And it would be fascinating to see a similar study done to show how much carbon is sequestered because of the otters in Elkhorn Slough. But of course, it's a small area compared to kelp. When he did his study, it was studying kelp beds all the way from Alaska down to California.
Now, are the otters that are living outside the slough in the open ocean and the otters that are in the slough, are these different species? How is it that some of them decide to live inside, some of them decide to live outside?
That's a hard question to answer in the sense that we never know why otters do what they do. We just observe what they do. And it has to start with the story of only 50 to 100 otters left after the fur trade, and they were down by Point Sur. So they were used to living in a rocky environment, so they're eating the type of prey items that they can find in that environment. So some clams, but a lot of other items that were living in rocky areas, and also sea urchins that were out there, abalone and like that. And it took a long time for them to actually come back into Monterey. And when they did, as they got into Monterey, that's when the kelp beds started flourishing again, and they really colonized the Monterey Bay area again. And then gradually they came up to Elkhorn Slough in the early 80s. That was mainly a male group, and then that male group left, and then they came back, and the females came in. And it's a learning process, we think, for the otters to be in a different environment. Now, instead of talking about abalone and sea urchins, they're learning to forage off of more crabs and lots of benthic prey, the clams in particular, the Washington clams and geoduck clams, pismo clams, all of that, and fat innkeeper worms that is a plentiful available food source in Elkhorn Slough, but it was different from what they were on before. And then the numbers have gradually increased as those otters were there. And what we found through other studies is once a female is in Elkhorn Slough, she stays in Elkhorn Slough. And any of her offspring that are female also stay in Elkhorn Slough. So our population is just gradually increasing until now we're reaching pretty much the threshold of what Elkhorn Slough can support, which is a little over 100 otters. But it's very good for them, but it was probably a learning process to get back into a different environment and know how to use it, and then the word to spread, however it spreads among otters, for other otters to come.
And I understand that the aquarium in Monterey also supplied some pups, rescue pups?
Yes, Elkhorn Slough turned out to be an ideal environment for them to release the otters. The aquarium does a program of when they find otters that are in distress that they can save, and they save them, and in particular the pups, they raise them. So they started a whole program of having surrogacy mothers to help raise the pups, and they needed a good place to release them where they could track them. Elkhorn Slough is ideal because, first of all, it's such a great environment, but secondly, because it's relatively small, so an otter released in Elkhorn Slough is easy to find. Most surrogacy-raised pups that they release take 2 or 3 separate releases before they're actually able to fend for themselves in the wild. So on the first release, the otter probably goes back and forth in the slough looking to find things and ends up losing weight. And after 2 or 3 days of not foraging correctly, they have to be recaptured, rehydrated, refed, and then after a couple of weeks period, they can be released again. Second release is almost always much more successful. But if it isn't successful enough, then they'll do it on a third release. But Elkhorn Slough was the ideal location and environment for that. And the aquarium thinks probably as much as 50 or 60% of the otters that are in Elkhorn Slough are a result of the otters that they release there. So you release an otter, when that reaches maturity, usually about the 3rd year, if it's a female, she can have pups, and then she'll have a pup every year after that. And then her pups, once they reach maturity, they'll start having pups. So it's a really good story, and it leads to thoughts about how we could reintroduce otters into another area. So now that we know that the surrogacy program is so successful, if there was a group of otters in another area, but only a small group, then perhaps the aquarium would be able to augment them with these surrogacy-raised otters that really have no other place to go. You can only keep so many in captivity. It's very expensive. Releasing them in Elkhorn Slough is probably not that productive anymore because Elkhorn Slough is reaching carrying capacity. And indeed, along the coast, they've reached carrying capacity. They can't expand to the north or the south because of the sharks. They haven't expanded to the north or south. So you have a limited area.
Could you explain what you mean by because of the sharks?
Yes. So sharks do not want to eat otters. But what happens is the shark sees this dark object up there that's furry. It looks kind of like a seal or a sea lion, and they take a bite. And it's much the same as with surfers. They don't eat the surfers, they don't eat the otters, but their way of telling if it's worth eating is to take a bite. And when they do that, it's fatal almost always for the otter. They're just so small, and their body is so small, and one bite from a shark, they don't die right away, but they will die. So along the coast, we have kelp beds pretty much from Santa Barbara up to Monterey, and indeed in Santa Cruz. But as you go further north, you come up to Año Nuevo, where the elephant seals had their colony. White sharks like to hang out around there to take advantage of the available prey items. And as you go to the south, around Santa Barbara, the kelp beds are gone. Otters can't create kelp beds. They can just help them expand by keeping the urchin population under control. So at both ends, the otters are limited. If they go beyond the ends, they're likely to be eaten by sharks. Otters all along the coast are eaten by sharks. In fact, that's the number one cause of otter mortality now. But it's even harder when they go to the end. So it's unlikely that the otters on their own are going to expand any farther north or south. They haven't for a couple decades. And they can't go further out into the ocean because the water depth gets to be too great. So in reality, we're kind of limited in how the otters are going to be able to increase their numbers unless somehow we're able to have them expand their range, either into another estuarine environment like Elkhorn Slough, which is our dream, or further along the coast for one reason or another.
So if San Francisco Bay in the past had this huge otter population, can you reintroduce it there?
It's possible, but it needs a lot of studying and it needs a lot of coordination, both with the public, with the fisheries, and with all the regulations. First of all, southern sea otters are an endangered species, so it takes an act of Congress to authorize doing something like that. And furthermore, it takes lots of studies, which are just beginning. So San Francisco Bay now is not the San Francisco Bay that it was back in the 1800s when otters were there. Much more pollution there now. There's a lot of runoff from still coming from when they did all of the ore mining up in Nevada and California. There's a lot more boat traffic. So before we can do anything, we have to find out what's in San Francisco Bay now. There have been some initial studies looking at prey availability, looking at where the boats are going, where boat traffic is most likely, what the water depth is, other items that we can look at relatively simply to find what areas of San Francisco Bay might be suitable for otters given the current conditions. So that's the first part of the study. That'll take many years to do that, and other areas need to be looked at as well. There might be other more suitable areas where otters could be reintroduced and perhaps be better for the environment and better for the otters and better for the fisheries. Although otters are going to eat crabs and clams, the eelgrass bed's thriving enables more of the flatfish and other fishes to use that as a nursery. So it takes some of the population down, some of the prey items down, but on the other hand, other items, prey items, can increase. So all of that needs to be studied, and there's not going to be any movement of otters into San Francisco Bay or any other area for at least a decade or more. The first efforts at relocating otters will probably be up in Oregon, because there the local Indians tribes are very anxious for the otters to be restored to their area. They think that's how it was previously. They'd like for that to come back. So studies are ongoing right now looking at that, and that can be done with the northern or Alaskan sea otters that aren't an endangered species. So it's a lot easier to get the permitting and all that's involved in relocating that. And from what we know so far, the public is very positive on relocating otters onto the Oregon coast again.
But if the southern sea otters are an endangered species, and if the Elkhorn Slough has now reached its carrying capacity, how can they expand, or will they not forever be endangered?
That's a good question. We don't have the answer to that. We think that the answer lies in either the otters on their own, getting past Año Nuevo or getting past the Santa Barbara area, or it's going to take help from the scientists to relocate them. That's our hope, is that somehow they get into San Francisco Bay. But again, it takes a lot of studies to look at that and see if that's really feasible, and then to get the public support for doing that, and then to get the permitting that would be required to do that. So it's not this is a good idea, let's do it tomorrow. It's this is a possibility. Let's study it in depth and see how possible it really is, and then what roadblocks there are in the way of doing it.
One thing that is remarkable is none of you are biologists, right?
That's correct.
You
And
are-
we should introduce Susan, at least give her a chance to say hi.
I would love that.
Susan is the newest member of our team. She's been with us for about 3 years now. But Robert and I just started this as not knowing anything, having no real goals or anything, and it's just kind of grown over time to where it's grown from just two of us with occasional people helping us to now we have a team of over 25 people. And Susan came along and said, whoa, you guys have got to get organized. And so she's taken on the responsibility of organizing our team and keeping communications up the way they should be, to having all the equipment labeled and so people can check it out and things like that.
Susan, could you tell us a bit about what this big job that you've taken on is like?
Or
and
what I got talked into.
yeah, you got talked into.
And I'm
yeah?
not sure how that happened. I met Ron and Robert also through Team Ocean. They were the Otter guys, as we called them, and they came down and did their little spiel and talked some people into coming on out and looking at otters and counting otters with them. So I joined the team about 3 years ago, going out to the field, and it was just that when they started, there was only 2 of them, and then there were 5, and now there's, like Ron said, over 25 people. So I just started to document for myself information, and I have a background in that. I actually have a degree in science, but made my career in corporate communications and training, and so I was like, saw this need that we needed to put process and procedures in place and, document where we're going and what we're doing for consistent data taking. And so it kind of took off from there. So now I work with these, 27 people who come from all different types of careers, mostly retired, but we do have some individuals who are in school right now studying biology or zoology, different marine sciences. We have a couple retired people from science. We have engineers, high tech, ex-science teachers, all kinds of different individuals who are really involved.
And all these people are dealing with just the otters, or is it expanding out to the hundreds and hundreds of other wildlife that you have?
Well, our particular group is called ROMP, and we're the Reserve Otter Monitoring Project, and we really focus on the otter population in Elkhorn Slough. There are many other groups that are studying otters in the area, and other groups that are studying other marine mammals as well as marine invertebrates and so on. At the Elkhorn Slough, there is a variety of other opportunities for volunteers to study different things or participate in different capacities. Our group focuses just on the otters, but there are many individuals in our group who, like Santa Cruz County and Monterey County, everybody volunteers for multiple things. So they may be participating in other science organizations or various other nonprofit organizations.
We've heard about the various effects that the otters have on the slough and that the slough has on them. What about interrelationships between different types of species? And we've talked about the crabs and the slugs, but in a broader sense, is there any effect that the otters have or that they receive from the birds, from the mammals? They're not just there on their own, they're part of a larger ecosystem.
Yeah, I think their biggest effect as a top predator is on the prey. Like Ron said, in the slough, they're feeding on things differently than what they're probably feeding on in Cannery Row. So they're really focusing on clams, a lot of clams, bivalves, innkeeper worms and things like that. So they're affecting their own prey population. In terms of hanging out with the seals and the sea lions, I don't see a lot of interaction, although sometimes they are close to each other. But they don't really interface that way that I've seen, at least not in observing them. I don't know, Ron, if you...
No, but that's one of the things that we do observe. The neat part about this, and as Susan indicated, we have quite a eclectic group of volunteers that are helping us with various backgrounds, and they're also volunteering at other places. And one of the things we've done is we started looking at seals also, just to see how many seals were there and do counts of them to see what they're doing. We do see otters and seals interacting, but it's very, very seldom. They mostly tend to ignore each other. Both of them react very cautiously to humans. They clearly know humans are a threat, but they don't consider each other a threat. But the sea lions tend to hang out just in the harbor, and they like to be on hard surfaces. But I've seen otters hauling out on the same dock that the sea lions are hauled out. When we look at Yampa Creek, which we'll kind of cover in a little bit, we see otters and seals hold out in the same creek area, relatively close to each other. As far as birds, we see otters eating birds. They are a carnivore, and at times they eat birds. So these are things that happen, but not very frequently, but it's part of the joy of being out there as you see these types of interactions that you don't hear about any other way. It's only by being out there, spending the time in the field, that you really get to see these things.
One side benefit, though, from us being out there all the time is you become very familiar with the wildlife, both otters and other animals. So if we see a sea lion struggling, or if you see a seal who's injured or a pelican or whatever, because we're out there all the time, we'll report that in to people who can help those animals.
Our time has gone by so fast. I can't believe it. We've really only got about one more minute. So is there anything that you haven't had a chance to tell about your project that you would like to mention before we go?
Well, I think I would like people to go to the Elkhorn Slough Reserve website, and they can see the same thing we're seeing on the Otter Cam. So if they go to elkhornslough.org/OtterCam, they can see what we're excited about.
Oh, I'm glad you brought up the Otter Cam. That's a very important thing. I'd like very much to thank my three guests, Robert Scoles, Ron Eby, and Susan Russo, for having come today. And thank you so much for all the information that you've given us. Your story is such an exciting story, and I'm very, very happy to have had the chance to have it be shared more widely. So thank you all very much.
And thank you for giving us the chance to share our story.
You're very
As you
welcome.
can tell, we've had a great time, and we're happy to share it with others and even have them join us.
Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure to have you here.